The war of skeptics and believers is a never-ending tragedy. Thank you for clicking on this video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today we are going to be talking about the Manhattan murder well. Not only is this case still unsolved, it has paranormal experiences to it, but it also is said to be the first American murder trial that was written about in the newspapers due to the mystery surrounding the entire thing. By the way, I'm doing Suspect Summer all summer long if you didn't know, so I would love your support by thumbsing up, by subscribing, and by letting me know down below if you're liking these videos. Now let's get back to the story. A young woman named Elma Sands, or Elma as her friends and family called her, was living in New York City in 1799. Some thought that she was more sad and depressed, some thought she was happy and cheerful, and maybe she was both like most of us are, or maybe she just wasn't good at hiding her feelings, or maybe she was really good. But either way, the judgment of her always seemed to be a little skewed, and nobody really knew the truth about Elma. So it was December of 1799, and Elma lived in a boarding house with 6 other people at 208 Greenwich in New York. Now the reason she could live at this place is because her cousin was actually married to the owner of the place. Their names were Catherine and Elias Ring, and they owned the boarding house, so Elma got to stay there. Another one of their cousins named Hope Sands got to live there too, as well as a young woman named Margaret Clark, and then a carpenter named Levi Weeks lived there with his apprentice who stayed in the same room as him, as well as a man named Richard Crocker. Elma was a beautiful young woman who is said to be a Quaker actually, which is where she was in the Religious Society of Friends. They helped abolish slavery, they helped to promote equal rights for women, and they also helped to promote getting better education in prisons and for the mentally ill. But it was Sunday, December 22nd, and Elma had gone missing. Earlier that day, her cousin Catherine had actually helped her get ready that whole day because she was said to be going out with one of the other roommates, Levi Weeks, who is the carpenter. So she was getting ready all day, she was super excited about it, and then when she got ready, she got done, her and Catherine went their separate ways. And at about 8 p.m. that evening, Catherine heard the door shut. She didn't see anyone come or go, but she just kind of assumed that it was Levi and Elma and they were going to go on their way and come back later, so she didn't think much of it. It was also a very snowy evening, and Elma had borrowed a fellow roommate's muff, which was basically a little fur pouch that you could stick your hands in during that time to keep them warm. So she took that with her when she left. And a few hours later, at around 11 p.m. that evening, Levi Weeks walked back through the boarding house door. Catherine immediately went up to him and said, "Where's Elma?" And when she asked this, Levi was very surprised, saying that she should not be out alone so late at night. And Catherine kind of said, "Well, I thought she was with you." And he said that she was never with him that night. The city was quickly covering with snow, and Elma still was not home. It went through that night into the next day. She still wasn't home. The searches began. Nobody could find her, and eventually a week later on that next Sunday, Elias Ring, her cousin's husband, hired a man to go and drag the Hudson River to see if she was in there. But her body was not found in that river, and the fingers quickly started pointing to Levi Weeks. Witnesses came forward saying that night she went missing, they saw Elma in a one-horse sleigh accompanied by 2 men, one of which they thought was Levi Weeks. But New Year came, and it was officially the beginning of the 1800s, but Elma's family did not have much to celebrate because Elma still wasn't being found, and it was several days later. But on the 1st of the year, 11 days after Elma disappeared, 2 boys were playing at the intersection of Green and Spring Street when they saw an object floating in the Manhattan well. They went over to check it out, pulled it out, and it was a muff used for your hands when it was cold outside. It was brought to Elma's roommate that she had borrowed it from, and the roommate confirmed that yes, this is her muff, the one that Elma borrowed. So right off the bat, Elias Ring went to the well to check it out and also to the boys' home that found the muff to talk to him about it as well. Shortly after that, Elias led a team with the boy's father in tow to the meadow. That is where they came upon the Manhattan well. But the Burrs Manhattan Company had actually built this well and then decided that they didn't need to use it and built another one somewhere else. So this one was just kind of abandoned. It was supposed to be kind of sealed off by wooden planks above the top of it, but one of those boards right in the middle was actually pried off. So the searchers began kind of lowering poles down in there to feel around to see if they could feel anything inside the well. They started feeling something, and then when they tried to kind of hook it and pull it up, it was far too heavy to grab a hold of. So one of the searchers had to run back, grab some rope, and then together they made a simple little net, put it down in there, and slowly brought the heavy mass up. As they were bringing it up, they saw dark hair, a wet shoulder, and a face looking up at them, and they confirmed that it was Elma Sands. There was also a lot of material from a filthy dress she had been wearing, and it was something purely out of a nightmare. One of the searchers ran to grab the constable, or the public officer in that time, to come and get him to take over the scene. Basically, there was a crowd that was gathering because of course they just found a body of a woman who had been missing for nearly 2 weeks. By the time the constable got there, they were already whispering about who they believed did it: Levi Weeks. So by the time he got there, he was kind of already under the impression that Levi had done this and was being pressured by the crowd because they were already saying that they wanted him hung, because that was the normal thing to do with criminals back in that day. And so right away the constable went and headed to find Levi Weeks with the entire crowd, or mob basically, behind him. So the constable finally found him working in his brother's workshop where he worked normally, and once he walked up to him, Levi saw the crowd around. His first words were, "Is it the Manhattan well she was found?" which chilled and stopped everyone dead in their tracks. And you have to remember that back then there was no news, there was no phones, there was no instant communication. How did he know that so quickly? I mean, they had to go and fetch people to get a response, and it wasn't that easy to know everything that was happening. So how did he know that, and why would he say that if he knew that they were all coming in to question him? Well, I told you that Levi lived in the same house as Elma during this time, and he was a pretty handsome young man, but he also fancied a lot of women. He had an interest in all 3 girls that were living there that were single: Hope, her other cousin, Margaret, and Elma. So it was kind of like he liked them all, but it was a little bit deeper of a relationship with Elma. Some of them had seen him go into her room late at night on multiple occasions, and that day she went missing, she actually told her cousin Catherine, who was helping her get ready, she was going to secretly marry Levi that night. As I said, Levi worked for his brother, whose name was Ezra Weeks, and he was an architect for landmark New York buildings. I mean, these were like huge name. He really had his name and his business in the public eye, and it was doing really well. Levi's job was to supervise the workers at these sites, and these included the Grange and Alexander Hamilton's estate. People noticed really quickly that Ezra actually had a 1-horse sleigh that resembled the one that witnesses had seen Elma on the last night she was seen alive. So the coroner went ahead and performed an autopsy on Elma's body just to basically prove or disprove the rumors that she was pregnant, which could have been a motive for murder. She was not pregnant though, thankfully. But shortly after, Levi Weeks was arrested for her murder. Even before the trial, newspapers were publicly talking about what was happening unlike anything before. I mean, Elma and Levi's roommate, Richard Croucher, had actually went around saying that Levi had murdered her and that he had an accomplice in New Jersey who had confessed to it all. And so the newspapers were really clinging on to the story and running with it, and this was the first time that this was happening. Nowadays it's so common that gossip leads to the news, but this was basically the first time that it happened in a criminal case. Handbills were published saying this, the Gazette was also saying stuff, and the General Advertiser was saying things like, But alas, little did she suspect that the arrangements she had been making with so much care, instead of conveying her to the temple of Hymen, would direct her to that bourne from which no traveler returns. One had actually said that he could be innocent and Elma could have committed suicide because her family did think to search the river, which would be something you would do if you thought possibly your family member had committed suicide. But this was completely drowned out by all of the other news outlets that were saying that Levi was a murderer. Not the immediate family, but Elma's family were wanting to get people involved. They were showing that they wanted vengeance. They had Elma's body put in the middle of the street, and this was because apparently inside the boarding house got too crowded from so many people wanting to come in and see her body that they had to put it out on the street. But this just got more and more people riled up and wanting to get her justice. Now, there were guards put around her body while it was on the street, but nobody wanted to harm Elma or her body, I guess. They wanted to harm Levi with a burning passion. Levi was so hated that if you didn't think he was guilty, then people would think that possibly you were. The trial began a few months later on March 31st of 1800. Back then, the defendants did not have a right to counsel, but with the judge's approval, you could have an attorney come and discuss certain points of law with them during the trial. And Levi Weeks had 3 of the best. So his alibi the entire time was that he was at his brother Ezra's house eating dinner that night that Elma went missing, that he was there the entire time until 11 p.m. and then he went back to the boarding house. Now, because Ezra's name was in this, he of course needed to prove that it was true, and he had a great bunch of contacts to do that, so he called them up for help. These 3 people were Brockholst Livingston, Alexander Hamilton, and Aaron Burr. Now, Hamilton and Burr disagreed on pretty much everything, but they decided to do this trial together because of the money payout at the end, which would be pretty great, and also because they owed a debt to Ezra, and back then a debt to somebody was everything. But since those 2 actually weren't attorneys, they hired Brockholst Livingston to do that actual part with the law, and he knew more about that, and he had actually participated in other murder trials as well. It was also found out that Aaron Burr could have had a different motive for wanting to be involved with this trial. He actually owned the company that owned the well where Elma Sands had been found. The first day of the trial was a complete circus. Everyone wanted to see Levi imprisoned in the community, and so everyone was there basically to show their support towards Elma. Now, the witnesses were called up to come and testify that they saw Elma on this 1-horse sleigh that looked like Ezra's, but when Hamilton went up to ask them about it, he got them to admit that basically they really couldn't see the color of the sleigh in the dark, and they didn't really know what Ezra's looked like to compare them that well. Then they tried to ruin Elma's reputation by saying that she committed suicide, that she self-harmed a lot, she talked about killing herself, and also that she was sleeping with her cousin Catherine's husband, Elias. Then medical experts were brought in to give their opinion on whether or not she was murdered. There was a doctor that said that there was bruising on her neck and her butt, and that her clavicle clicked when he pressed on it, meaning that she was strangled. And she was strangled so hard that her collarbone actually snapped. The defense called witnesses up for Levi and his alibi, confirming that he was at Ezra's house that night eating dinner, and that he didn't leave until around 11 when he got to the boarding house, and that he would have had no time to commit that crime. They also confirmed that nor Ezra or Levi took their sleigh out that night. His brother Ezra testified, said basically the same thing, and that possibly the reason that he had said is at the Manhattan well where she is found when they first came to him was because he had kind of been hearing the news around due to his contacts, and he had mentioned something about the area where they were searching which had the well in it, and Levi kind of knew that area well with the well. And then they called their own medical experts who said that there was no violence indicated on her body, but there was enough water in her lungs to indicate that she could have drowned. Then a neighbor of Elias Ring came forward saying he had heard Elias and Elma together when his wife and her cousin Catherine was out of the house. This neighbor had told their roommate Richard Croucher, who was the one spreading the rumors that Levi did it. Back then, trials lasted a day or less, and normally never more, but this one was different. It went on for 15 hours straight until 1 a.m. on April 1st when they had to stop because the jury was getting too tired. They had to stay and sleep at City Hall until the next day when they went all day into the next morning at 2:25 a.m. It was April 3rd already, and the prosecutor wanted to wait until the next day so he could get his closing statement ready, but the judge said that that was unnecessary, and the jury went back to decide. It took them 5 minutes to come back and say that Levi Weeks was not guilty of Elma Sands' murder. Cheers rang out in the crowd from people who had just wanted to hang him, but they still didn't like him, which makes no sense to me. After he actually had to leave town because he was hated so much, he moved to Deersfield, Massachusetts, but they found out all about his past and he had to move again to Mississippi, and there he actually became a successful architect himself. A few months after the trial, Richard Croucher was actually arrested for the rape of his young stepdaughter. He had threatened her, saying that if she told anyone, she would be killed, just like Elma. It was found then that back in England, where he was from, he actually had a psychotic break where he tried to slay someone, and he got the nickname Mad Croucher. He was put in prison for the rape of his stepdaughter, and when he was finally let out and pardoned, he was told he had to leave the country and go back to England. He didn't, of course. He only went to Virginia, where he was then arrested for theft. And after that, he had to be sent back to London, and the last we know of him is that he did some heinous crime and was put to death for it. During Elma's trial, they actually had a very weird sense of the man who was Richard Croucher. Now, either Burr or Hamilton, it's not specified which, took a candle to Richard's face as he was testifying and said, "I have special reasons when the red culprit is detected and placed before the court will be understood." And then they asked him if he had been the one spreading the rumors, and he said yes. At the end of Elma's trial, Catherine Ring, her cousin, actually put a curse upon the entire room. And the judge in Elma's case, John Lansing, disappeared a few years later, never to be seen again. 61 years later, in 1861, is the first kind of sightings that people saw from the Manhattan murder well of Elma Sands. Shrieks were said to be heard, flashes of light, and a woman draped in white. Some believe that is Elma Sands haunting the place, and it's actually been put on the American Travel Channel as one of the 10 most haunted places in America. I mean, men and women both have reported seeing ghostly figures at the intersection of Green and Spring, where this all happened, and some have said that they have heard her screaming and pleading for her life. And this is because 40 years prior, in the 1820s, wealthy people had actually built houses in this meadow on this land, and one of them was placed on top of this well. It is in 129 Spring Street in New York City. It's been a remedy shop for tobacco addiction. It's been a German beer hall. Then it was abandoned in the early 2000s because the Manhattan Bistro actually needed to use it for storage, and they actually unearthed the well that had been hidden for many years, and the eerie thing about it was it looked exactly the same as it did way back when it was first built. Like it hadn't aged a day. It's now COS or COS clothing store, which is like a sister company of H&M, and it's actually still in the basement, which is open to the public to go see. It's like the men's department. Basically, employees say that Elma haunts the place all the time. There's missing merchandise, there's broken elevators, there's electrical shortages. The well still stands today, and Elma apparently still haunts it according to the people that are around it. It's in the bottom level of a store, the men's department in the back, right next to a cash register. And if that doesn't creep you out, I don't know what will. But Elma's death still remains unsolved to this day. Do you think that Levi did it and murdered her because he didn't want to be with her? Or was it Elias because they were having an affair and he didn't want Catherine to find out about it? Or was it Richard, who is so adamant on blaming somebody else? That's what makes me so angry about certain cases, when there are so many different options, but none of them are good enough to actually get answers. So you leave me down below what you think, because I need to know your theories, and please thumbs up if you want more Suspect Summer or videos like this. I want to remind you, with such dark content, that you are powerful enough to become the darkness or to brighten it. I love you, and I'll let you go. Bye. Find the facts, and opinions will always rush through any cracks.